Neil Diamond's life begins in the crowded corners of Brooklyn in 1941, where survival often mattered more than comfort and dreams were considered luxuries. Born to immigrant parents who carried the weight of displacement from Eastern Europe, he entered a world shaped by scarcity, resilience, and quiet endurance. His childhood was not defined by ease but by observation, watching his parents stretch every dollar, every meal, every moment of hope. The atmosphere at home was heavy with responsibility, yet it also carried an unspoken lesson: endure first, understand later. As a child, he often escaped into imagination, finding refuge in the glow of movie theaters and the distant promise of music drifting from radios and passing streets. These early impressions would later become the emotional foundation of his songwriting. Even before he understood structure or melody, he understood feeling, loneliness, longing, and the fragile beauty of fleeting joy. Brooklyn did not offer him a stage, but it gave him something far more important: emotional truth. That truth would later shape a voice capable of reaching millions, not because it was perfect, but because it was human in a way that could not be manufactured or imitated. Immigrant hardship and the search for stability. His parents' journey from hardship abroad to uncertainty in America shaped the emotional landscape of Neil Diamond's early life. They arrived with hope, but hope alone does not pay rent or fill empty cupboards. His father worked tirelessly, often returning home exhausted, while his mother stitched together a sense of stability through sheer determination. When his father was drafted during wartime, the family's fragile balance shifted again, forcing relocations and emotional instability. One of the most defining chapters of his childhood came when the family moved temporarily to Wyoming, a place that felt unfamiliar and isolating compared to Brooklyn's dense rhythm. For a young boy, this displacement deepened his awareness of loneliness and adaptability. He learned to watch more than speak, to absorb rather than react. Music and imagination became his companions in unfamiliar surroundings, offering him a private escape from uncertainty. These early disruptions did not break him. Instead, they sharpened his sensitivity to change and absence. Later in life, those emotions would resurface in his songwriting, where themes of longing, separation, and resilience would echo with authenticity rooted in lived experience rather than invention. A guitar, a scholarship, and the first rejections. At 15, Neil Diamond received a modest guitar, an instrument that would quietly transform the direction of his life. It was not polished or valuable, but it became a vessel for expression in a world where expression often felt restricted. He practiced relentlessly, turning repetition into discipline and discipline into identity. Later, a fencing scholarship brought him to New York University, where he enrolled in pre-med studies under expectations of stability and conventional success. Yet his attention drifted constantly toward music rather than medicine. Between classes, he ventured into Tin Pan Alley, carrying songs instead of textbooks, hoping someone would listen. Most doors closed before he could finish a sentence. Rejection became routine, delivered with indifference that stung more than anger. Still, he returned repeatedly, driven not by confidence but by necessity. Eventually, he made a decisive and frightening choice, leaving college just short of completion to pursue songwriting full-time. It was not a romantic leap, but a survival instinct shaped by belief in something undefined but persistent within him. That decision placed him directly in the uncertain world of music publishing, where talent alone rarely guaranteed opportunity, but persistence sometimes created it. Struggle in the music industry and early survival. Breaking into the music industry did not immediately bring success or relief. Instead, Neil Diamond entered a period defined by financial strain, emotional exhaustion, and constant uncertainty. His early work for small publishing companies offered little security and even less recognition. He wrote songs under pressure, often questioning whether persistence was an act of belief or denial. When one of his early recordings failed to gain traction, it reinforced the harsh reality that talent alone was not enough to guarantee visibility. At times, he lived in near-poverty conditions, surviving on minimal food and unreliable housing. Nights were often spent in cramped spaces or temporary accommodations, where music was both his escape and his only companion. Yet even in this fragile state, he continued writing, driven by a sense that silence would be more devastating than failure. These years shaped his resilience more than any success later would. The industry was not kind, but it was instructive. It taught him that rejection was not an endpoint but a recurring condition of ambition. Every setback sharpened his voice, making it more honest, more grounded, and eventually more compelling to a world that had not yet learned to listen. Breakthrough songs and the first wave of recognition success arrived gradually rather than explosively, but its impact was transformative. As Neil Diamond's songwriting matured, his ability to capture emotional clarity began to resonate beyond industry skepticism. Early hits brought attention, but it was his work written for other performers that first revealed his reach. Songs that became global sensations carried his creative fingerprint, even when his own name was not at the forefront. This paradox, being widely heard but not fully seen, defined an important phase of his career. Eventually, songs like Solitary Man and Cherry Cherry began to establish him as more than a behind-the-scenes writer. His voice carried a distinct emotional weight, blending vulnerability with strength in a way that felt both intimate and universal. Recognition did not erase his loneliness, but it validated his persistence. Each success added momentum, slowly shifting him from obscurity into visibility. Yet even as audiences grew, he remained deeply aware of how fragile success could be. Fame was arriving, but it had not yet stabilized into permanence. He was no longer struggling to be heard, but he was still learning how to live with being heard by millions at once. Sweet Caroline and the Weight of Global Fame. The creation of Sweet Caroline marked a turning point that transformed Neil Diamond from successful songwriter into cultural phenomenon. Written in a burst of inspiration, the song carried a simplicity that allowed it to transcend generations and geography. When performed live, it became something larger than music, a shared experience between artist and audience. Stadiums filled with unified voices, turning the song into a collective ritual rather than a performance. Yet behind this extraordinary success was a growing emotional complexity. Fame expanded outward, but his personal life became increasingly internalized. Hotels replaced homes, and applause replaced conversation. While millions sang his lyrics in celebration, he often found himself returning to silence once the stage lights dimmed. The contrast between public connection and private isolation grew sharper with time. He had created something that brought people together, yet it sometimes highlighted his own sense of separation from ordinary life. Even as Sweet Caroline became an anthem of joy, it also symbolized the paradox of his career, the ability to unite crowds while experiencing solitude within that unity. The song gave him immortality in sound, but not necessarily companionship in life. Love, marriage, and the cost of constant motion. As fame expanded, Neil Diamond's personal relationships faced increasing strain under the demands of constant travel and creative obligation. His first marriage reflected a time when life still allowed space for shared growth, but as his career accelerated, distance slowly replaced presence. Family life, once grounded in routine, became fragmented by touring schedules and recording commitments. His children grew up in moments of absence punctuated by brief returns, creating emotional gaps that could not easily be repaired through material success. A second marriage brought renewed hope and stability for a time, offering companionship during his rise to global recognition. Together, they built a family and shared years that felt anchored, yet the pressures of fame continued to stretch the boundaries of domestic life. The contradiction was constant, providing security through success while being physically absent from its experience. Love existed, but it was tested repeatedly by time, distance, and expectation. Eventually, even strong foundations began to fracture under sustained separation. What remained was not failure of affection, but exhaustion from a life that rarely paused long enough for relationships to fully breathe. Divorce, isolation, and the quiet after applause. Divorce marked a deeply reflective period in Neil Diamond's life, not as a single event but as a gradual realization of accumulated distance. The dissolution of his marriage was not defined by public conflict, but by quiet acceptance that love alone could not withstand the demands placed upon it. Financial settlement and public attention followed, but neither addressed the emotional complexity beneath the surface. Returning to empty homes after years of filled schedules created a stark contrast between external success and internal solitude. The rooms that once held family life now echoed with absence, reminding him that achievement does not guarantee emotional continuity. Fame had expanded his world, yet it had also narrowed his private circle. The realization settled slowly. Being admired by millions does not replace being known by a few. In the silence that followed, reflection replaced momentum. He continued working, but with a different awareness of what success had cost. The applause that once felt like validation now coexisted with a quieter understanding that presence, not recognition, defines emotional fulfillment. The afterglow of fame revealed its shadow more clearly than its light: grief, loss, and the shrinking circle of life. As years passed, personal loss began to accumulate with increasing emotional weight. The death of his parents marked the first profound shift, removing the foundational figures who had shaped his earliest understanding of perseverance and love. His father's passing represented not only familial loss but the disappearance of a living connection to sacrifice and survival. Later, the loss of his brother deepened this sense of emotional contraction, as shared history became memory rather than conversation. Each loss reduced the circle of familiarity that had anchored him through decades of change. Friends and mentors from earlier stages of life also passed, leaving fewer voices that remembered him before fame defined his identity. Grief became less of an event and more of a condition, something that accompanied reflection rather than interrupting it. Even success could not counterbalance the emotional silence created by absence. The stage remained filled with audience energy, but personal life felt increasingly quiet. Over time, he learned that longevity in life does not guarantee continuity in companionship. What remains is memory, and memory becomes the only form of dialogue left when voices are gone. Parkinson's diagnosis and the end of touring life. The diagnosis of Parkinson's disease marked a turning point that shifted Neil Diamond's life from public performance to private adaptation. Initially subtle symptoms, small tremors, moments of imbalance, and physical hesitation were easy to dismiss, but over time, they became undeniable. For a performer whose identity was built on control, rhythm, and precision, the progression of the illness represented a profound challenge. The realization that touring could no longer continue was not only a professional decision, but an emotional reckoning. Retirement from live performance symbolized the end of an era that had defined most of his adult life. Yet even in withdrawal, music remained central. He continued to sing privately, adapting expression to physical limitation. Support from his wife and family became essential, transforming daily life into a shared structure of care and continuity. Although the disease imposed restrictions, it did not erase his creative identity. Instead, it reframed it. Music became less about projection and more about endurance. The stage was no longer physical but internal, where memory and emotion continued to generate meaning even when the body resisted performance. Legacy, peace, and the song that never ends in later life, Neil Diamond's existence became quieter, shaped by reflection rather than pursuit. Living away from the demands of touring allowed him to experience a form of peace that earlier success had never fully provided. His home became a space of continuity, where family presence replaced public expectation. While physical limitations altered his daily routine, they did not diminish the emotional resonance of his past work. Songs like Sweet Caroline continued to echo globally, performed in stadiums and gatherings where audiences carried his voice forward collectively. This ongoing presence created a legacy that functioned independently of his physical participation. Wealth and recognition remained part of his story, but they no longer defined his present experience. Instead, meaning shifted toward connection, memory, and the enduring life of music beyond its creator. In moments of reflection, he would return to the piano, not to perform, but to remember. The music that once carried him through hardship now carried others through their own moments of joy and belonging. His story ultimately resolves not in silence, but in continuation, proof that artistic expression can outlast the limitations of time and body, becoming something shared long after its origin.